I'm Eric Van Hove. I'm an artist from Belgium. My parents are from Brussels, but I grew up in Cameroon, Yaoundé. I was born in Algeria. My name is Dutch, coming from Antwerp. I speak French. It's all a bit complicated, which I guess is reflected in the piece I'm proposing here. Basically, I was in Dakar 5 or 6 years back, spending time with a blacksmith there. And you know how when a car in Europe drove over 300,000 kilometers at the odometer, it tends to end up in Africa, where it runs another 1,000,000 kilometers as a taxi or something. Then when these cars are really completely destroyed, then they are gathered by this blacksmith, and they melt all these engines down, take the aluminum out, and melt it in the ground in a technique we actually use. It's a very rudimentary casting technique we use for this engine because it's in use in Morocco as well. And so they would melt down these engines and transform them somehow in spoons and pots for the local markets. And I stayed there for a while looking at this sort of transformation of matter. While the matter keeps experience from its 1,000,000 kilometers around the world, it becomes a spoon. So that was the first sort of idea that dragged me to this. And then the other thing was seeing an engine, I think in some auto salon, by chance I was there. I saw this very large Volvo truck engine just by itself, and it struck me in a poetic sense that an engine, because it's made of very small parts that don't seem to matter at all, and then some much bigger parts that seem to matter a lot, they nevertheless have to fit in perfectly with each other in order for it to work. And that's a good metaphor of a social system, from the micro to the macro. A society is that, and the Moroccan society is really about that. I mean, this piece is kind of a monument for the craftsmen that made it. They understood that they were the bolt, meaning these tiny elements that seems invisible but are paramount for it to run, for it to work. It's an utopia, it's a possible utopia that this engine could be born here in Morocco, and that all these heritage and various elements of this society, however different they are, could plug perfectly, because if we could reassemble this V12 Mercedes, clearly it is perfectly done, inside out. And I heard the story of this guy in Casablanca called V12 Laraki. He's an industrial designer. And in 2002, he decided to try and make a 100% Moroccan-made supercar. And this car was called the Laraki Fulgura, of his name, Laraki. And so he started, and he made this car. 2004, it was shown at the Geneva Auto Salon. So it's kind of like Lamborghini-based chassis or whatever, and it's perfect, mouche arabier, the grid for aeration and everything. The thing is, he wanted to show, I suppose, what the Moroccan industry could fathom, but the thing is, and it's a long thing. I mean, in post-colonial theories, you hear of that a lot. People in this continent have to prove themselves, and they try to find on the same ground. So, make a supercar is somehow the ultimate thing to achieve. But then he couldn't find the time or the money or the energy, the resources to make this V12 engine entirely in Morocco, like a Laraki V12. So when I heard of the story, he basically took a Mercedes engine. He took a Mercedes-Benz engine for that car. And what's a supercar without an engine? Clearly, it's an engine on wheels. So, 80% of that 100% Moroccan-made supercar is clearly German, which is kind of a pity. And it got me thinking that there is 20% of the national workforce in this country, the craftsmen, they're 3 million, are part of the industry as well. And they're rather, absent from the discourse of this guy. So I thought these people can actually take on the challenge of making a 100% Mercedes, a V12 engine made in Morocco. And talking about this other side of the industry here that nobody hears much about, really. And so I asked Mercedes for an engine. I couldn't get one. Anyway, so I went to Latvia in a wrecked S600, the biggest Mercedes Berlin car where you have these engines. Some rich guy there put it in a tree. So then I got lucky and I could buy the engine off. So I went to Riga, bought it there, bring it back to Marrakech. A local mechanic helped me dismantle it entirely. And then over the course of 9 months, I looked for the best craftsmen I could find in the country, all the way from Merzouga in the north with the Algerian border to the south in Tiznit, and trying to incorporate all the techniques and all the crafting material I could find into reproducing these 465 components of this engine. And 9 months after, that's the result you get. There is the vanity in contemporary art as much as in society about what's seen and what's grandiloquent, what's fascinating. but usually the details doesn't matter and tends to matter less and less. It's a whole spiritual thing as to care of the inside. For example, speaking of the context in the souk, which is just 100 meters from here, and it's part of the tourism also that's coming to Morocco. One of the main industry in Morocco is tourism. Tourism tends to be only about decoration, what it looks from the outside. And the craftsmen, since the 80s, have been doing more and more of the, the decorative aspect of how it looks and the shininess outside, and the inside tends to be rotten. So I was very interested in basically finishing off every element of that engine, because if I didn't anyway, people would say, well, it's a nice sort of like piece of wood, carved, whatever. I wanted it to finish inside out because it's the only way it would make sense. Why? I think because it's an Oedip. I don't know if you say that in English, but it's an Oedip. It's like when the craftsman, being the very bottom of the industrial system, the industrial ladder, this Mercedes engine was made by some of the best engineers in the world, really, and over 100 years. And then you end up with that piece, which is Mercedes V12 engine, the most technically advanced, I think, engine there is. And then if the craftsman manage to reproduce faithfully, meaning you can reassemble it, meaning everything inside is also done, no treachery, no lie. So if you can do that, then these craftsmen sort of kill the father. If they can reproduce a V12 engine, they can move on to something else. Yeah. They don't have to try to dream of proving themselves or proving they exist in the 21st century at all. They are part of this industry and they can fathom this. And if they can fathom this, I think, I'm going to try now with the atelier I just installed in Morocco to push the boundaries further and see if we could bring craft to make car parts, customized, play on the post for this 21st century, really, which is about flexible specialization rather than mass production. People in the souk mass produce ashtrays, which the governments help them export, which really benefit only the tourist that exports cheaper the thing he bought, but the craftsman doesn't really do it, beside mass producing things. I think if they use the same amount of material and the heritage they have and the technique they know, they can actually explore and enter share of the market that will be more beneficial for them. Why this material for this piece and so on? Well, it was very simple. Some parts, because of their shape and their structure, imposed certain types of material. What was thin and long had to be in metal. What was like, very intricate, like the engine block, had to be in wood, because casting it with the techniques here would not be possible. So basically, it's only consequences of the structure of these parts themselves that sort of like implicate the actual aesthetical result. And by the time we actually assembled it, which took about 2 months with 15 people, it suddenly was there and we could see what the result was, which none of us could really fathom. Many parts are actually decorated by the craftsmen themselves. They had a lot of latitude to do that. It basically had to fit within. That was the only rule. And it wasn't even my rule. It's like the rule of the engine somehow. It's the system that wished that. But then there is a lot of intricate part. For instance, one example, the pistons, so there's 12. The piston heads are made of ammonites, fossils. So ammonites is these shells you find all over in the desert around the world that come from the dinosaur time, yeah? And you have them the size of a truck wheel all the way down to very tiny bit. So we had to go around in Merzouga in the Algerian border in the desert and try to look for these shells of 18 million years shells that fossil had the same diameter as the piston of this Mercedes engine specifically, then carved it out of the rock. Then this master over there, like sort of, cut it and polished it, carved inside to be able to put the rest in, well, to fit it the engine. So that's really intricate, and it's not to be seen on that scale now. I mean, obviously because it's mounted. So it's all really, really intricately finished inside, and that's an aesthetical, philosophical, emotional decision on our parts. That's made of yellow copper. That's nickel silver. It's sizzled with diamond, jeweler's blades. So they sew these shapes together. They've been drawn by yet another master. The bowls are made of recycled copper, and basically, when we do this, we start with large sheets of yellow copper. Then we cut these things within and assemble it. That's more sculpture. That's sizzling. then it's welding with tin. Then after that, we get all these déchets, these default, these tiny bits of brass, which are, and those we go and melt them, and so recycle. So there is a whole like sort of sustainable recycling sort of thing part of this, because all these bolts have been made with the remnants from the copper that was used in the engine, melted down and cast it in the ground. So every bolt you have on that engine, if I manage to unplug one, is casted in the soil and to the identical to the original one, and then turned to make the filtage with the same tool you have here, which work on cars to replicate car parts. So then that's all entirely made of carbon. That's zellige, it's the terracotta enameled with various different pigments coming from different parts of the country. There's so many different materials that it's really hard to track sometimes. It's all local, so there is 13 types of wood. There is tuya from Essaouira. There is the ebony from Makassar. There is the tuya roots that come from Agadir. I mean, so basically you can trace back from the material. Materials are like, I think, they're catalysts. They gather things from the earth, right? They come from certain places. Then they moved around. These craftsmen have a parcours within the country as well. And so this engine, I think, is a catalyst of catalysts. It really is a heart that gathers everything. Over there you have the name of the 57 craftsmen that contributed to the work. And basically this project becomes theirs. And they knew it was theirs, and I invited that from them. Their name was on it. Even the cleaning lady for the studio, name is on it. And it's because of this collective love that we had and desire to achieve this for ourselves collectively that we could make that happen. When you work on something like that, it goes much beyond you. So I couldn't fathom exactly what I was doing. I think it's part of my job as an artist as well. If you're a pathfinder in some ways, you're not sure where you're heading for. So I just had this intuition, really, and I followed it. I communicated that intuition and that desire to these craftsmen, and they joined me on that basis. And then we went on, and 7 months within this 9-month production, I really realized, looking at them and how they were giving themselves in this, that they could never go backward. They cannot go back making chairs after having pushed themselves and find out they could actually make a V12 engine. So we had to continue, same for me. So I discovered so many different aspects and possibilities working with them that I want to now, I decided to move to Morocco. So I decided to move the atelier, which was in Brussels, to Marrakech, hired 8 of them to work for me for a year with me. And then we're going to continue now making more things, and hopefully in several years we'll speak again, and I can tell you more about that, about the future and how it changed me. But that's already a big thing, the fact that we just became so close that we are family now. Now we are working on this very big catalog that's going to come later this year. We'll have 200 images of every part there is in that engine, close-ups we made. And eventually, later, because I think it's good that a work like this, which is quite spiritual, to be honest, take its time to open up. Like, actually, if you meet somebody you don't know, you're not going to immediately show the color of your belly. You're just going to wait for a little bit. So I think this artwork is about that same thing. It's not entirely mine. It's a collective intelligence and emotion thing. So by respect for all of this, I just want to open it slowly. So I think in a year from now, in a museum in Belgium, we're probably going to try, which is one of the next thing that's going to come. We're going to try to open it as a performance. Probably it takes about a day, and we'll just scatter it up. And so people can see all of the extent of the amount of pieces, but also how it's finished, the abstract of it, and then we reassemble.